There's a moment almost every driver has felt at least once. You turn the wheel, expecting the car to follow, and instead you feel a strange resistance, a pulsing under your foot, and the engine power drops on its own. It feels like the car is fighting you. In reality, it's the opposite. It's a system called electronic stability control, and it just made a decision in under a tenth of a second that most likely kept you out of a ditch or off the wrong side of the road. In this video, we're going to open up exactly how that system works, sensor by sensor, and explain why that fighting feeling is actually the clearest sign that it's doing its job correctly. Let's start with what the system is actually called, because the name changes depending on the manufacturer. Some call it ESC, Electronic Stability Control. Others call it ESP, Electronic Stability Program. Some brands use DSC, VSA, or Stably Track. Different badges, same underlying idea. A computer that constantly compares where you're trying to steer the car against where the car is actually going, and intervenes the instant those two things disagree. To understand why this system exists at all, we need to go back to a very specific engineering problem that automakers were struggling with in the 1980s and 1990s. Single vehicle accidents caused by loss of control, not collisions with other cars, but cars simply spinning out or sliding off the road on their own. Anti-lock brakes had already solved part of the problem, preventing wheels from locking up under hard braking in a straight line. But ABS could do nothing to prevent a car from sliding sideways through a curve, or spinning out after a sudden steering correction. Engineers at Bosch and Mercedes-Benz, working somewhat independently in the early 1990s, arrived at a similar answer. If you could measure the car's actual rotation around its vertical axis, and compare it to what the driver was asking for with the steering wheel, you could detect a skid before the driver even fully felt it. Mercedes-Benz introduced the first production version of this technology in 1995, on the S-Class, developed jointly with Bosch. The very famous and slightly embarrassing catalyst for widespread adoption came a year later, in 1997, when a Mercedes-Benz A-Class rolled over during a Swedish elk avoidance test, a routine maneuver used to simulate swerving around an animal in the road. The rollover happened on a car without stability control. Mercedes responded by making the system standard equipment on that model, and the rest of the industry took notice. By the early 2000s, stability control had gone from a luxury option to a feature government regulators started requiring outright. In the United States, it became mandatory on all new passenger vehicles by the 2012 model year, following research from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration showing it reduced the risk of fatal single-vehicle crashes by around half, and fatal rollover crashes by more than 70%. That's the history. Now let's get into the actual engineering, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Electronic stability control isn't one sensor or one part. It's a coordinated system built on top of the same hardware already used by ABS and traction control with a few critical additions. The first key sensor is the steering angle sensor, mounted on the steering column, which measures exactly how many degrees you've turned the wheel and how fast you're turning it. This tells the system what you, the driver, are asking the car to do. The second critical sensor is the yaw rate sensor, and this is really the heart of the entire system. Yaw is the technical term for rotation around the car's vertical axis, essentially how much the car is spinning, clockwise or counterclockwise, as viewed from above. The yaw rate sensor uses a small vibrating element, built on the same kind of microelectromechanical technology found in smartphone gyroscopes, to detect the Coriolis effect produced as the car rotates. In simple terms, it measures how fast the car's body is actually rotating, independent of where the wheels are pointed. The third sensor is the lateral acceleration sensor, which measures the sideways g-forces acting on the car, essentially how hard the car is being pushed sideways during a turn. And finally, the system uses the same individual wheel speed sensors already installed for ABS, which tell the computer exactly how fast each of the four wheels is spinning, independently of the other three. Now here's where the actual logic happens. The car's stability control module is constantly running a comparison, dozens of times per second, between two separate pictures of reality. The first picture is what the driver is asking for. Based on steering angle and vehicle speed, the system calculates the yaw rate the car should be experiencing if it were gripping the road perfectly. The second picture is what's actually happening. The real yaw rate measured directly by the sensor, along with the real lateral acceleration and the real speed of each individual wheel. When those two pictures match closely, the system does nothing. It stays completely silent, invisible, exactly as it should during normal driving. But when they start to diverge, when the car is rotating more or less than the steering angle says it should be, the system identifies that as a skid beginning, often before the driver has consciously registered anything is wrong. At that point, the system has to figure out which of two fundamentally different skids is happening, because the correction for each one is almost the opposite of the other. The first type is understeer, sometimes called plowing or pushing, where the front tires lose grip first and the car continues in a straighter line than the driver is steering, refusing to turn as sharply as commanded. The second type is oversteer, sometimes called fishtailing or a slide, where the rear tires lose grip first and the back of the car swings out wider than the front, rotating the car more than the driver intended. To correct understeer, the system needs to help rotate the nose of the car back into the turn. It does this by applying the brake to the inside rear wheel, the wheel closest to the center of the curve. Braking that single wheel creates a small torque that helps pivot the car's nose back toward the driver's intended path. To correct oversteer, the logic flips completely. The system applies the brake to the outside front wheel, the wheel on the far side of the turn. That single wheel's braking force creates a counter-rotating torque that pulls the back of the car back in line, straightening out the slide before it becomes a full spin. In both cases, the system can also reduce engine power in real time, cutting the throttle or adjusting ignition timing to reduce the amount of force being sent to the wheels while the correction is happening. This is precisely the sensation drivers describe when they say the car is fighting them. The pulsing you feel through the brake pedal is the hydraulic pump inside the stability control module rapidly modulating brake pressure to a single wheel, sometimes dozens of times per second, completely independent of how hard you're actually pressing the pedal. The sudden drop in acceleration you feel, even with your foot flat on the gas, is the engine control unit temporarily reducing power output, because more engine torque at that exact moment would only make the skid worse. None of this is a malfunction. It's the system correctly identifying that your inputs and the car's actual physical behavior have started to disagree, and it's using the only tools available, individual wheel braking and power reduction, to bring them back into agreement. There's an important nuance here that a lot of drivers misunderstand. Stability control does not increase the total grip available to the tires. It cannot create traction that isn't physically there. What it does is manage the grip that does exist more precisely than a human driver can, distributing braking force to individual wheels with a level of speed and precision that isn't achievable through the brake pedal alone. This is also exactly why the system has real physical limits. On ice, in deep snow, or on a wet surface with worn tires, there may simply not be enough available grip for any correction, human or computer, to fully prevent a slide. Stability control reduces the likelihood and severity of a loss of control. It doesn't repeal the laws of physics. Most modern systems also include what's called active yaw control logic layered with rollover mitigation, using the same lateral acceleration sensor to detect conditions where a vehicle, particularly a taller SUV or truck, is at elevated risk of tipping during a very sharp maneuver, intervening earlier and more aggressively in those cases. Some manufacturers have refined this even further with torque vectoring, a related technology found in more performance-oriented vehicles, which can send different amounts of power to individual wheels, not just brake them, to actively help rotate the car through a corner rather than only correcting after a skid begins. It's worth mentioning how this system interacts with traction control, since the two are often confused but solve two different problems. Traction control activates when a wheel is spinning faster than the vehicle's actual road speed, typically under hard acceleration on a slippery surface, and reduces power or brakes that individual wheel to restore grip. Stability control activates based on the direction the entire vehicle is rotating, regardless of whether any wheel is technically spinning too fast. In modern cars, both systems share the same sensors and the same hydraulic brake control module, working together as a single coordinated safety system, even though they're solving conceptually different problems. There's an interesting statistic worth sitting with here. Research published by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety found that stability control reduced the risk of a fatal single-vehicle crash by roughly 49%, and the risk of a fatal rollover crash by approximately 80% for SUVs specifically. Very few individual pieces of automotive safety technology, in the history of the industry, have produced a measurable reduction in fatalities anywhere close to that number. There's also a common misconception worth clearing up about the button on the dashboard that turns stability control off. On most vehicles, that button doesn't fully disable the system. It raises the threshold at which the system intervenes, allowing more wheel slip and more rotation before the computer steps in, which is why some drivers use it in snow, sand, or mud, situations where a small amount of extra wheel spin can actually help the car dig out or maintain momentum. A small number of performance-oriented vehicles do offer a genuine full disable mode, usually reserved for closed-course track driving, and even manufacturers that offer it are usually explicit that it isn't intended for public roads. Another detail that surprises a lot of drivers: stability control doesn't just react to your steering wheel and pedals, it also uses that same sensor suite passively in the background even when nothing seems to be going wrong. On many modern vehicles, the same yaw rate and lateral acceleration data feeds into other systems entirely, including adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, and in more advanced vehicles, the early logic layers of automatic emergency steering. In other words, the stability control hardware installed in your car back in the early 2000s became, over time, the foundation that a huge amount of modern driver assistance technology was quietly built on top of. It's also worth addressing response time directly, because it's genuinely difficult for a human brain to process how fast this entire sequence happens. From the moment the yaw rate sensor detects a discrepancy to the moment brake pressure is actually being applied to the correct individual wheel, the entire decision loop typically completes in well under a tenth of a second, several times faster than the average human reaction time to a visual hazard. That speed is precisely why the intervention can feel abrupt or even alarming the first time a driver experiences it. The system isn't being gentle, it's being fast, because the physical window to correct a developing skid before it becomes unrecoverable is extremely short. There's one more piece of the puzzle worth understanding, and that's how the system distinguishes a genuine skid from a perfectly normal, aggressive turn. A skilled driver taking a corner hard, with tires still gripping the road, will show a yaw rate that closely tracks the steering input, just at a higher intensity than normal driving. A car that's actually sliding shows a yaw rate that stops tracking the steering input altogether, either falling behind it in an understeer condition, or overshooting it in an oversteer condition. That divergence between expected rotation and actual rotation is the single signal the entire system is built around, and it's precise enough to avoid unnecessary intervention during ordinary spirited driving, while still catching a genuine loss of control almost immediately. So the next time you feel that pulsing brake pedal, or that sudden dip in power during a sharp turn on a wet road, you'll know exactly what's happening underneath you. A yaw rate sensor detected that the car was rotating differently than your steering wheel commanded. A hydraulic module identified which single wheel needed braking to correct it, and an engine control unit trimmed power for a fraction of a second to give that correction room to work. It's not the car disagreeing with you. It's dozens of calculations per second, quietly working to keep your intended path and the car's actual path as close to identical as physics will allow.